Okay, so this is Lecture 1, Part 1, Introduction to Social Welfare Policy. Uh, you guys can follow along with me with the PowerPoint slides. I'm basically narrating the PowerPoint slides for you guys, so I think it'd be helpful just as a starting matter to go ahead and print out the PowerPoint slides and just follow along and take notes as you see fit. Okay, so I'm on slide 2 right now. What is social welfare policy? We'll start there with the definition of social welfare policy. Uh, the first place I look to, Wikipedia. Not a very good source, but this is what Wikipedia has to say about social welfare policy. So they say that it's that part of public policy. So essentially they're saying that it's a branch of public policy or one part of public policy that has to do with social issues. So not very helpful for us, I think. It is informative in the sense that it tells us that it's a branch of social policy or a branch of public policy, but aside from that, it's not too helpful. It says that we deal with social issues. Okay, not so helpful. I'm on slide 4 now, if you're following along. Uh, we go to a more credible source, and that's Harvard University. And they have this to say about social welfare policy. They say that it's public policy once again. So it's once again, it's a branch of public policy. And they lay out the very specific areas that are covered in social welfare policy. So they mention healthcare, they mention human services, they mention criminal justice, inequality, education, labor. This definition is perhaps a little too specific. The last one was a bit too broad, and so we need something sort of with a good balance. And so we go to our definition. This is from your textbook, the Donito textbook. And this is what Donito has to say. She says that social welfare policy is basically what a government in the US, so we're talking about domestic policy in her view, so what the government chooses to do or not to do. So what she's saying there is that it could be either government action or inaction, and then she lays out some specifics. She says regarding the income, services, healthcare opportunities that are available to basically vulnerable populations, right? So if it's government action or inaction that affects vulnerable populations, she calls that social welfare policy. And in terms of vulnerable populations, she mentions some in her definition, so the aged, blind, disabled, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in short, our definition here is that social welfare policy is government action or inaction regarding the income, services, and opportunities available to vulnerable populations. I'm on slide 6. You can, as you're following along. Slide 6, so I give some examples here. The first example I give is Social Security. The acronym that you see there is Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance. That's the acronym for a Social Security program. Is that social welfare policy? Well, our definition, I think it fits our definition. Social Security is an income support program. It provides income maintenance or income support to elderly, the disabled, and survivors, survivors and spouses, essentially. So I think it fits our definition. I think it's one of the clearest examples of a social welfare policy. The next example is Supplemental Security Income. The acronym there, you see, SSI, stands for Supplemental Security Income. I think this is clearly within our definition of social welfare policy. This is a program for aged, blind, and disabled. Another income support program. So if you're hearkening back to our definition, to Donito's definition, it's talking about income support. Right? That's part of the definition, and it affects a vulnerable population. We're talking about the aged, the blind, and the disabled. The next program, the next example that we have is Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. This is the name given to our welfare system. Clearly, I think this is clearly within the definition of social welfare policy. We have vulnerable populations, people who are economically deprived, right? They're economically vulnerable. It's an income support program. It fits within our definition. Medicare. Medicare is a healthcare program offering public health insurance to elderly and disabled. So clearly within our definition of social welfare policy. The next example is Medicaid, another public health insurance program or federal-state joint health insurance program. So historically, this program was for kids and seniors, but with healthcare reform, this program is going to cover the working age population as well. but I think it fits our definition. It offers health services or health insurance, health coverage, in other words, and it affects vulnerable populations, kids and seniors, and soon to be the working age population who are uninsured. And then finally, there's child protective services. Certainly within our definition of social welfare policy, these are victims of child abuse, child neglect, child sexual abuse often. Uh, it's a vulnerable population. It's offering services, social services, to an otherwise vulnerable population. It's a government unit that's providing services, so it fits our definition. Slide 7. I note here some other examples, not so clear with these particular examples. Foreign policy, I would say no, not necessarily within the scope of social welfare policy as we've defined it. Uh, I think you can argue that it's outside the scope. It's not really affecting a vulnerable population. There might be some populations at war, but that's sort of stretching the definition. The type of service that's offered, there's not really a service that's offered necessarily. The next example, military policy. Again, I think outside the scope of our definition. Environmental policy. So this is an area that's covered in public policy courses, but in terms of social welfare policy, probably outside our definition, I would argue. The last two here, educational policy and tax policy, I think it fits within our definition. Educational policy certainly affecting a vulnerable population, kids, right? Offering a type of service by the government, often if you're talking about public schooling, certainly educational policy, offering education services to an otherwise vulnerable population. And then finally, we have tax policy. We do cover tax policy in this class. Educational policy we cover in 357 for social work majors. It's in your second policy class. But in terms of tax policy, so general tax policy is probably outside the scope, but tax treatment and its effect on low-income populations. So certainly, if it's affecting low-income populations, that's going to be within our definition of social welfare policy. So EITC is a program we cover in this class. The next slide, slide 8, is about classification. So how do we classify all these different policies that we're looking at? Well, one way is to look at eligibility. How does one become eligible for the program? And we often make a distinction between social insurance and public assistance. Social insurance, the gist behind social insurance, a social insurance program, is that you must contribute to get something out of the program. So there's some sort of contributory scheme involved. In the case of a public assistance program, there's no such contributory mechanism. Typically, there's just a means test. So there's a test of income and/or assets to see if you qualify for the services. So we often make that distinction when we're categorizing according to eligibility criteria. We also make a distinction between entitlement programs and non-entitlement programs. In the case of an entitlement program, what we're saying there is that if a recipient is found to be eligible, then there's an obligation on the part of the government to provide some sort of benefit to the potential recipient. Okay? In the case of an entitlement program, in the case of a non-entitlement program, even if you're found to be eligible, there's no obligation on the part of the government unit to provide services to that person. So often, one indicator of a non-entitlement program is if there's a long wait list for a program, that's probably a non-entitlement program because there's no obligation for the government to provide the benefit to the recipients, potential recipients. Examples. An example of an entitlement program, Social Security. If you're found to be eligible for Social Security, there's an obligation on the part of government, on the part of the federal government, to provide you with income support or income maintenance. In the case of a non-entitlement program, one example is our welfare system. So TANF is an example of a non-entitlement program. Even if you're found to be eligible under the state guidelines, there's no obligation for the state to provide you with any benefits. We can also classify based on the type of service that's offered by the program. So many programs offer income maintenance or income support, which I've alluded to in previous slides. Old age survivors disability insurance, that's Social Security. One example of an income support program. TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, that's our welfare system once again. Another example of an income maintenance program. Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, that's another example of an income support program. You have some nutrition programs. SNAP is the acronym, SNAP. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, what used to be called the Food Stamp Program. That's an example of a nutrition program. WIC, or Women, Infants, and Children, that's what it stands for. Another example of nutrition assistance. School lunch vouchers, school lunch programs. These are examples of nutrition programs. And then you have healthcare programs. These are programs offering health services, health-related services, Medicare, Medicaid we talked about. Medicare we talked about before, right? Social services, vocational rehabilitation is one example of a social service that might be offered. Any type of counseling, right? Support groups. These are all examples of social services. And then you have some tax programs, the EITC, or the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's a federal program. There are state versions of it, but that's another example. That's one example, I should say, of a tax program. One other example, sort of an indirect example, is the fact that your health insurance benefits, specifically your private health insurance benefits, the fact that they don't get taxed, that makes it indirectly a tax program. There's also child tax credits, another example of a tax policy. All right, so why do we care? Why should social workers care about social welfare policy as we defined it? Well, I think the strongest mandate is from our ethical guide. So the NASW Code, the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, if you look at that document, it tells us that we have a responsibility to keep current with policies. So I'll point you to the very specific sections of the code. Section 5.02a. If you go to that section, it says specifically, social workers should monitor and evaluate policies. So I don't think you can get any clearer than that as a sort of mandate for social workers to learn about policy and to understand policies well. There's the preamble. The opening section of the Code of Ethics says that social workers promote social justice. I think when we think about social policy, we often have social justice in mind, sort of at least in the back of our minds when we're thinking about social welfare policy. It begs the question then of what is social justice, and I'll get into that in the next part of this lecture.